Hello, welcome to Park Media. I am your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we are joined by Matthew Ho. Matthew Ho is on the advisory committee and board of Expose Facts, Veterans for Peace, and World Beyond War. In 2009, Matthew resigned his position with the State Department in Afghanistan in protest of the Obama administration's escalation of the war. He had previously been in Iraq with a State Department team and with the United States Marine Corps. He is now a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy and a disabled veteran. Thank you for coming on the program today, Matthew.
Thanks for having me here, Vince.
So give us an idea of what led you to eventually become a member of the State Department. Talk a little bit about your childhood growing up, how you end up in the Marine Corps and the State Department.
You know, I had a pretty normal childhood. I was the first, I think I'm pretty certain I was the first one in my family born outside New York City. So my mom and dad moved out of the city and made it, to the suburbs, kind of speak. And that's what we grew up in. I grew up in the suburbs of New York City. Dad was a firefighter for a while. Then he, kind of fell into an upper middle class job. So I had a very, not just normal, but like a very beneficial childhood. I was very lucky. Then I went to college, and after college I was bored. I was working in finance, and I wanted to become a firefighter actually, but at that point in the mid-late 90s, it was difficult to get into a fire department. I'd either missed the test, or I had the test wasn't for another 2 years, or and I only wanted to be part of a big city fire department. That's all I always tell people. Like, I had no conception. Well, you don't know when you're younger, but I only wanted to be, if I wasn't part of a fire department in Philadelphia or in Boston or New York City or Baltimore, one of the big places, and that, not being able to do that for a variety of different reasons, I ended up joining the Marine Corps, because I felt like that was the next best thing. I had this idea in my head that if you're going to be a bear, be a grizzly. I joined the Marine Corps, went to officer candidate school in January of 98. Did about 10 years in the Marine Corps. I was a company commander in Iraq in 06, 07. And I'd also been on a State Department team in 04, 05 in Iraq. And that got me introduced to the State Department. That got me a position there. I got appointed into the Foreign Service in 2009 and went to Afghanistan. And about halfway through my time there, 5 months in, I resigned in protest because I was morally and intellectually broken. I saw the war for what it was. It was nothing more than Bush's war in Iraq. This was Obama's war now in Afghanistan. He went from 30,000 troops in Afghanistan to 100,000 troops, 100,000 contractors, and 40,000 NATO troops, in his first year. And there was no difference between what the Obama administration was trying to do by militarily achieving victory in Afghanistan than the Bush administration had been trying to do in Iraq. I got asked a lot, and I still do, what's the similarities and differences between Iraq and Afghanistan? And I always say, look, the only similarity, the only thing that you need to understand is that the U.S. military is in both places, and it's trying to win military. It can't. The political emphasis is on a victory for the person in the White House. And that's all you need to know. I mean, and the results are going to be the same. It doesn't matter if this is happening in Iraq or in Afghanistan or North Africa or, wherever, the results are going to be the same. So the last 10 years, I've been doing anti-war work, peace and social justice work, those kinds of things.
So you joined the Marine Corps in 98. This is interesting to me, of course. I'm a freshman in 1998. Mm-hmm. I'm going into high school. I eventually joined the Marine Corps in 2002 following 9/11. I'm always interested to speak with veterans who joined the military prior to 9/11 and then saw that sort of unfold in real time. Can you sort of take us back through what you were experiencing in the late 90s, early 2000s? What was your initial reaction to 9/11 and even the reaction of the people around you at that time?
Yeah, it was in the late 90s, the concerns were humanitarian and disaster assistance. There was what we called non-combatant evacuation operations. So you go into an embassy someplace and pull the people of the embassy out, and that happened a lot, say like in West Africa. There was the Balkans, but that had no substantial ground component to it aside from, peacekeeping forces. Those were all just really U.S. Air warfare operations, I guess. So the idea that you were going to go into another war that was like a Vietnam was just anytime it was brought up. And when I got in the late 90s, we still had some colonels and generals, some sergeant majors who have been around for the tail end of Vietnam, and some of them have taken part in Vietnam. And they spoke about it in a manner that we will never do this again. We will never make that mistake. We'll never be an army of occupation. We will never fight an insurgency. I mean, you heard all these things. We'll never fight in a battle away. We'll never fight in a city again. The battle away was the last one during a Tet offensive that we'll ever do. Then within the amount of years, right, we're fighting in Fallujah, Ramadi, Baghdad, Samarra, Tikrit. All over the place in cities. So two things with that, I think. One, nobody knew what they were talking about or weren't very good students of U.S. history because everyone viewed Vietnam as a one-off. And then Korea was something kind of similar, but it was, that was a test of the new United Nations and the North Koreans invade, and there was no conception of American occupation and American imperialism as understood through, say, Native Americans, as understood through Central America, as understood through China and Korea in the late 19th century or early 20th century, or even, Japan with Commodore Perry showing up and saying, open up or we'll burn you down, basically. So this idea that we were actual real students of history is something that I always go back to because we weren't. And then how quickly all these colonels and generals who swore they would never make the mistakes of their predecessors regarding Vietnam, they all folded. They all retired and then didn't speak out against the wars, or, say a guy like General Peter Pace, who was the chairman and Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General Pace had fought in the battle away and a few other major engagement battles in Vietnam. These guys went right along with it. Right. No dissent, no, hey, I think this might be a bad idea. So, the two things I always go back to about that time and why it's important for people to understand is because the same types of thought processes and same type of people come into leadership positions. One, like not a real clear memory or understanding or history or knowledge of history. And then two, as soon as something that was really put in front of them as challenge came up, not talking about like the obstacle course or an endurance course or, right, a 20-mile forced march with a 75-pound pack or whatnot. That physical stuff is easy. It's the hard, right? You saw these guys that were, had become pillars in the Marine Corps, just go completely along with. And I was in the Pentagon for a while. I had been at the start of the Iraq War. I was on the staff of the Secretary of the Navy, and so I was around all these guys. I was around Pace. I knew Pace's aide quite well.
So that's where you were when the initial invasion happened in 2003.
2003, yep. And when 9/11 happened, I was actually at Dynamic Breachers course in Quantico. I was learning how to, become an instructor to teach people how to do explosive breaching. So. That's when you put the small charges next to a doorknob or on door hinges or on the side of a wall or whatever, and you blow through it, right? That's where I was at when 9/11 happened. And I remember the day after 9/11, sitting in a Waffle House with my buddy Jimmy, talking about Afghanistan. Both of us were just convinced that it was going to be over and done with in a few months. Both of us had read stuff about the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. So I remember sitting there with him and saying, yeah, there's no way, the Marine Corps will ever get involved in Afghanistan. There's no way we're going to do what the Soviets did. There's, like that type of thing. And this is just basically, we understood who Al Qaeda was. We figured, okay, yeah, maybe like the Navy SEALs and Delta Force and the Army Rangers might be involved, but this is really something for the FBI to handle. And I remember having this conversation with them, and this idea that there's no way we're going to be involved in this, that we're not going to take part. What are we going to do? We're going to show up in Afghanistan and get hit with, mines and booby traps, just like the Soviets did, and ambushes. And 19 years later, we're still doing it.
Right. And so in 2003, the initial invasion happens. You're working in the Pentagon at the time. When do you eventually end up in Iraq? And what is your thinking through this process of eventually ending up stationed in Iraq?
Yeah, so I got to Iraq in May of 2004.
Okay.
And the insurgency was really coming into its own. I was posted at that point. Like I said, I was on a State Department team for that first time in Iraq. And so I spent the first 6 weeks or so in Baghdad doing not a lot, taking part in kind of the transition from the Department of Defense to the Department of State, from the Coalition Provisional Authority under Jerry Bremer to, a U.S. embassy under John. And in terms of when he showed up, I read his bio, a few other things that, very simple, didn't get into his real history of what he took part in Central America, particularly in the 80s and I believe late 70s too, with the death squads down there. And then sure enough, what starts happening in Iraq a year or so after Negroponte is there, not even a year or so, within 6 months probably, the Shia death squads start operating. So again, this idea of understanding history and understanding people keeps coming back, right? It keeps kicking me in the stomach, basically, until I finally learned it. So I got there in May of 2004. People were in denial at the, as part of the American administration there about the insurgency. I would attend these meetings of upper staff, and there were car bombs going off at that point every day in Baghdad, leading Iraqis who were leading kind of the efforts on the United States side were being assassinated and targeted at will. There was the battle in Fallujah. The first battle of Fallujah had just happened. All kinds of stuff. There was just this, inability to comprehend what was occurring. The ideological blinders were on. The idea that we had white hats on, how could they not like us? Or there'd be these crackpot theories that would try and explain away the violence and the anger at the occupation. I swear to God, I remember sitting there one time hearing a story, now it's a story, but hearing somebody in this meeting talking about, once we get the traffic lights up and running again in Baghdad, then that will really take a lot of the stress and tension off the people, and we'll see a drop in support for the insurgency. Like that type of thinking, like that type of extremism in a thought process to avoid responsibility, to avoid being the bad guy was occurring. And also, too, there was just a lot of stupid people there. So I was there for the tail end of that first administration, the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was completely staffed by the stories you heard about it being a Republican Party operation is completely true. These were all staffers from Capitol Hill. They had very little understanding of what was occurring. They had been hired on because of their party loyalty. They were all going to the convention, the Republican National Convention that summer. They're going to go home, they're going to take some time off, and they would see each other at the convention. You heard that over and over and over again. So not only was this, an ideologically pure effort there, but it was also a very naive, inexperienced, immature. The decision making was crippled by both the lack of experience, as well as too the ideological purity that we are good, this will work. I know that's how they did it before, but that regardless of whether it worked well or not, I had a friend there. He was very funny. And he used to always end every conversation by satirically saying, and why won't the Iraqis just learn English already? Like that, because that was the type of mentality.
Oh, yes.
If they just went along with us, if they just pulled their weight, they just did their part, right. They would, this would be, the 51st state of the United States, basically, so you saw that over and over again. And then the insurgency, of course, picked up on the occupation. The use of the Shia-dominated government to try and suppress the insurgency turned it into an outright civil war, turned it into a genocide, basically, on both sides. And it was a catastrophe. I'm not a big fan of Tom Ricks, the former Washington Post writer and everything.
Same
but
here.
I will say that his first book about the Iraq War, titled Fiasco, was a really appropriate title. I mean, there is no other way of describing it other than it was a complete fiasco.
100%. Yeah. So you're there in 2004 in May. How long were you in country for? And then you're coming home now. You're coming back from Iraq. What are you thinking around that time? Are you becoming more politicized? Sort of what are you reading? Because as I'm listening to you talk, you've obviously gone through a process of learning a lot from 1998 up until 2004, and then even after that. So what does this look like, you coming home from Iraq? Are you becoming further politicized? What is your thinking going into, say, then the end of the Bush administration, the beginning of the Obama administration?
Yeah. So I'm there for a year. I get home end of May. I'm there for a little more than a year. I get home starting with Memorial Day weekend, or right before Memorial Day, 2005. And I remember going to visit my parents and seeing on Meet the Press, or one of those shows, one of the Sunday morning shows, Dick Cheney, the vice president, saying we're witnessing the dying throes or the death throes of the insurgency, and wanting to throw something, being so upset by that because of the lying. Politically, I had been all over the place in the 90s. I had voted for Dole. For first time I could have voted was 92. I chose not to vote because I didn't like anyone. 96, I voted for Dole. At that point, I was working in finance. I was reading The Economist and the New York Times every day, made sense. 2000, I was stationed in Okinawa. Never got our ballots. Never got our mail-in ballots at my unit. Yeah, the guy in charge of that screwed it all up. We never got our ballots. But I probably would have voted for George Bush in 2000 if for no other reason than I felt like after 8 years of Clinton, it was time for a change. No other real reason than that. But then in between 2000 and 2004, I really move solidly leftward. I go back to where I had been in college and at other times. And I remember in the 2004 primary, Al Sharpton was the guy I would have voted for. I was at that point, I really thought what he was saying, who he was representing. And that's where I've been since, very left. I ended up voting for Obama in 2008, and that's the last time I voted for the Democratic Party. And since then, I've always been, I think, pretty much after Obama. Well, of course, my dissent with the administration over the war, but then to the his dropping of the public option of the ACA. I remember exactly where I was standing when I heard that, right? And so that's where I've been. But I wasn't politicized. I wasn't going to speak out, and I still felt like I was too young to be doing anything. I still felt like I had too many career options in front of me. I still felt like I could make a difference. I still felt like I had a responsibility. So when I get back from that first time in Iraq, even though I believe the war is complete catastrophe, I think about walking away from it all, but then I end up going to the State Department and working on the Iraq desk at the State Department. At that point, I'm a reservist in the Marine Corps. And I'm sitting at my desk at at State, and I get an option to volunteer to take command of a combat engineer company. I was a combat engineer officer, and I jumped right on it. 8 months later, 9 months later, we were back in Iraq. In this time, my first time in Iraq, I was in Baghdad for a bit and then went north to Crete and was in Crete for most of that year. And then the second time I'm in Anbar province where the Marines were stationed for most of the war. And yeah, it was really bad when we got there in 2006. Every time you left the base, whatever base you were on, something was going to happen. Minor, or it might be, some guys got hurt or killed, but something was going to happen. And that's how it was up until around January of 2007 when the Sunni when the Sunni awakening occurs, when the Sons of Iraq occurred, when basically we stop marginalizing and disenfranchising and oppressing the Sunnis and actually bring them into the power structure and actually bring them into the share of money and actually bring them into the Iraqi military and Iraqi police and allow them to administer themselves. Because prior to that, they had all basically been administered by Shia forces, by Shia army or by Shia military police. I tell people this. I would say that, when I was with the Marines in Anbar, the Iraqis would much rather have an American Marine enter their house than a Shia Iraqi. It was amazing, that type of the hatred that had formed so quickly that hadn't existed prior to our invasion, but that then came about as a mechanism of survival, basically. Right. And so you witness all that, and then you witness the like I said, the de-escalation, the dropping in violence, which then of course gets attributed to General Petraeus and his surge tactics, which is complete nonsense, complete garbage, but it gets run with. So you come home from that, and you see what happens, and you see how it's being reported as, and just very frustrated with it all, but still not enough to allow myself to recognize how much I was lying to myself, to recognize how, even though I was trying to be as moral as possible in these wars, that's complete BS. You can't be moral in an immoral situation, particularly like war. Something is going to happen. Things are going to happen. So, I end up not really becoming politicized until 2009, 2010. Certainly my early work when after I left the State Department in protest and started speaking out, had a lot of press attention and which went on for quite some time. But that was always balanced. I was still always hedging at that point because I thought that there might be a career still for me. I still had these desires for, when you're part of a system, I guess, or you're part of an industry or whatever for that long of a time, you grow attached to it. And whether it's fear of leaving it, whether it's, uncertainty, whether it's because you have ambition or your own ego, it's hard to make that move. So even after I had, cut my ties with it publicly, I've been on the Today Show saying the war in Afghanistan is effed, everything else, I still couldn't go all the way and renounce the military and war and the U.S. government and, our foreign policy in general. So if I go and I look at some of the things I wrote, like what I wrote for the Wall Street Journal, like in 2010, it's all hedged. It's all like, well, we shouldn't have troops there, but we can be using drones. Stuff that like I a couple of years later, I was able to disavow completely and be honest with myself. But I found it a very hard process to give it all up. I think because I was afraid at the very end of really looking at myself and what I've been complicit with. I think that's really what it comes down to. And I often describe it as why a lot of veterans don't want to go down this route, don't want to talk about it. Even though, the majority of veterans don't believe the wars were worth it, they're not to open that door and take the step like, say, you've taken or whatever, is very difficult. And if you open that door, you can't close it.
Yep.
And it is, you go back to your classics, studying classics and your mythologies and everything, and how there's always some truth in them, right? And so this idea of Pandora's box, When you open that up, what's going to come out? And so it's better to keep those doors closed. And so I think that took a while for me to get past that.
Was it a difficult decision at the time? So this is 2009 when you resigned your position with the State Department. Is that correct?
Yes, it was. Yeah, summer of 2009.
What did that process look like? I mean, of course, tremendous pressure from your peers. I'm, of course, thinking about when I refused to go on a third deployment, I was sort of put on the worst working details as humanly possible. And, everybody, trying to isolate and alienate you from the general population as much as possible. And then coming home and eventually testifying to Congress, of course, then that opened a Pandora's box of hatred from fellow Marines and so forth. But I'm thinking, so I understand on some level those sort of social pressures, those institutional pressures, not quite as much as yourself, of course, because you had been in those institutions for quite some time before you decided to resign. So what did that look like for you? And then sort of take us to after that period of 2009.
So when I got to Afghanistan in 2009, I had been suicidal for quite a while, the PTSD and the moral injury. I've also got traumatic brain injury, which at that point in time, the symptoms weren't out, but was probably working in the background, I bet, just being around some explosive blasts. And when I got there, I remember I got there in April of 2009 and thinking to myself, being in the war again, I'm home, feeling that connection to it. And I had gone there thinking I'd rather die over there than die here at home. And I know a lot of guys had that when they volunteered for other deployments. But then I quickly realized that the war in Afghanistan was no different than the war in Iraq. The Obama administration was no different than the Bush administration. The generals were all the same. And it was one thing after another. It was seeing the just how the Taliban are by far not good people, but the Afghan government was so predatory. And it was also composed of, where the fighting was occurring, where the U.S. forces were in the south and in the east of Afghanistan. It's 97, 98, 99% Pashtun. And that's who the people that were trying to be subjugated. The Taliban was almost entirely Pashtun, and the Afghan government forces were, 96% non-Pashtun. Only 4% of them or so were Pashtun. And so, it really was the same as in Iraq, where the Shia Arabs were used to suppress or subjugate the Sunni Arabs. And the same things were happening. However, because of the success of the myth of David Petraeus and the counterinsurgency campaign of the surge in Iraq, that was what was going to happen in Afghanistan. Without any kind of reconciliation, without any type of understanding the grievances of the insurgency, the legitimate grievances of the insurgency, without understanding the history of the Afghan war that goes back to, basically, my opinion, 1973 when the king is deposed, without understanding any of that, without understanding that, look, basically, I'd be standing there in some village with these Afghan government officials and Afghan army officers, none of them who spoke Pashtun. My translator had to translate for the Afghan government folks because they couldn't speak to the Pashtun villagers and townspeople. And those people are viewing these people as, at least in the sense of the last 20 years, maybe 30 or 40 even, as their traditional rivals. Not understanding any of those aspects of Afghan society or history, all this stuff. This idea that counterinsurgency is going to be, it's there's these generations of warfare, first generation, second generation, third generation of warfare was the use of maneuver, so the Nazi blitzkrieg in 1940 was an example of third generation warfare, right? So this idea that we're now going into later stages of fourth and fifth generation warfare. And for guys like David Petraeus and his cult around him, to remember, Petraeus got there are members of Congress who wanted to give Petraeus a 5th star. This was a man,
and to run for president.
and to run for president. And I mean, this was a man whose ego just was dominating and moving everything in terms of the war. And, you know, Obama administration went along with him. General McChrystal went along with him. All these people below him. You know, and it was so corrupt the way the war was decided to be escalated, because rather than bringing in military officers, CIA officers, State Department officers, whoever, to evaluate the situation in Afghanistan and make a recommendation for General McChrystal and General Petraeus, all these think tank experts were brought in. All these guys that had already weighed in on and writing books on how great counterinsurgency were, and they were all being funded by Boeing and General Dynamics and Raytheon, right? These were the people that came in 2009 to recommend that the Obama administration escalate the war and utilize a strategy of counterinsurgency to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. Now, in my position there, too, as a political officer, I dealt with the Afghans, and I dealt with a lot of men that were, and it was all men. You didn't deal with any women. That's just the way the society was. That's not a Taliban thing. That's an Afghan society thing. The Afghan government is nearly as misogynist as the Taliban, if people aren't aware of that. But the, you know, I dealt with Taliban interlocutors. I probably dealt with some Taliban themselves, and they were trying to negotiate. And as I would go through things, and as I would repress from that region and everything else, you saw this consistent desire for the Taliban to talk. And here we were backing them into a corner, giving them no choice, because we wanted the president to be a better wartime president than the Republican was. Because, you know, all these generals wanted to be the best, you know, to have this this new theory of warfare. This they want to be the ones who proved and implemented successfully counterinsurgency warfare, so they could go to the, you know, the Hall of Fame of generals or whatever. And you know, so you just, you know, seeing that, and same as had happened in Iraq, the same mistakes, everything else, how corrupt everything was, and then, like I said earlier, I was morally and intellectually broken. And so after 5 months there, I couldn't go along with it. I mean, I think if there's something that like was the final incident, was probably the election in 2009, when, you know, I witnessed, you know, I mean, I soldiers stuffing ballots. And then when I reported that back to the U.S. Embassy, the response was, you weren't supposed to see that. Basically, that didn't happen. You know, right. That polling station doesn't officially exist. So what you saw didn't happen. So the lying that was occurring institutionally. But when I did resign, and I think this is a difference for me, have been on the officer side and everything, than being, because I've gotten this from a lot of guys and gals and Veterans for Peace and in IVAW, is I mainly had support. I mean, it's mostly been support. I can tell you that in Afghanistan, when I resigned and my resignation letter went around, my counterparts in the other provinces, in the other, you know, and these are all very violent provinces, were all supportive. You know, the military officers I was working with in the province I was in were all supportive. You know, the ambassador was supportive. He wanted me to stay, you know, but he agreed with me. Richard Holbrooke, who was the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan, Pakistan, he told me, you know, I had to go meet him in New York City, you know, and I met him, and I also met his British counterpart, Jared Copper-Coles, and both of them, you know, were very supportive. Holbrooke told me he agreed with 96% of what I'd written in my resignation letter. You know, I mean, so there was, and so the Post, I was upset at the way the debate was being framed after I got home. And so I wanted to just write an op-ed for the Washington Post, because this was October now of 2009, and a lot of discussion about escalating the war, and just not a lot of contrary information, not a lot of anything that was going against the narratives of the Pentagon. And, you know, I also have been told directly by Holbrooke that his knees had been cut out from underneath him by Hillary Clinton. I mean, so there was no the stuff that was reaching the president was all what was approved by the Pentagon. And in a clever way, too, where the Pentagon and Bob Gates, who, after I had this notoriety and I had to go and meet with all kinds of senators and people like that in Washington, D.C., I never heard anyone spoken about as badly as Bob Gates was, the Secretary of Defense and former CIA. His nickname, I guess, was No Fingerprints Bob. And so Gates is able to portray himself as, this man who has come back against his will to take over the Secretary of Defense. He has stayed on with the Obama administration. He really wants to be back home, but he's doing this for the best of his country. A complete rubbish, all manufactured for public. And the same thing too. I mean, there's a big New York Times story about how Biden's on one side, Clinton's on the other in the administration in terms of what to do Afghanistan, and then Gates is in the middle. And that was nonsense too. That was all manufactured by the Pentagon to make it seem as if the Pentagon was being neutral and fair in their role in advising the president in terms of giving him all kinds of options. And when that's complete garbage, it's all very savvy in terms of, well, the Pentagon's the biggest public relations. I want to say that each year the Pentagon spends about $7 billion on public relations, including recruiting and advertising and all that. And just for comparison, the largest public relations company in the world spends $900 million. So give people an idea of how good and how big the Pentagon is in turn when it comes to public relations. But yeah, so I ended up being interviewed by the Washington Post, and huge, big 3,000 word story, above the fold, front page. And the point of all this is when I asked Karen DeYoung, who wrote the story on me in the Post, why did you do this? Why did you write this big story on me and everything and give me so much time and attention and you did it so well? And I said, why did you do this? You didn't know me. You don't owe me anything. And she said, because everyone I asked about what you have written and what you were saying, at the Pentagon, at the White House, at the State Department, none of them disagreed with you. I mean, and then I would hear these other stories as I would start to meet people. And, I knew the guy who was the U.S. political ambassador to NATO in Brussels. And Jack told me that when the plan to escalate the war in Afghanistan, to surge in Afghanistan, if you will, went around the offices at NATO in Brussels, nobody agreed with it. But when it came time for them to check mark off on the routing sheet, none of them dissented.
Right.
All those colonels and all those generals, not just from the United States, but all from throughout Europe, went along with it. So, I mean, there was this inertia that had just made it impossible for people. And I met a lot of guys who would say things to me like, I wish I could do what you're doing, but I've got 2 kids that are heading to college in a couple of years. So the golden handcuffs were very real. The fear of being iced out, the fear of being, and certainly, yeah, you do. You get completely iced out. I had General Petraeus was in charge of Central Command in Tampa at the time, and they hired they were on retainer or working from already, but a private strategic communications firm, was tasked with discrediting me, So, I mean, they've set up a fake Wikipedia page, they contact all kinds of television producers and news reporters, they say, all that kind of stuff. So it's very real in the sense of how organized the institution is when it comes to defeating dissent. I mean, you see this with the media, right? I mean, you see this with the concern about having access. There's so many.
Well, my God, we've seen this with Manning and Snowden.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. With them. But then, and so if you, now particularly say with the media, if you go and you speak with Manning, you speak with Snowden, you challenge the Pentagon press briefing over and over again, your credentials are going to expire. Yeah. And then you're not going to be let back in.
Right.
And now you're a national security reporter, and what good are you? You're not allowed to, and the Pentagon really brought this to a whole nother level in the early stages before the Iraq War, when they had that whole, when they came up with this whole official embed system.
That's right.
Right. And they took these reporters to these mock boot camps, basically, and, and buddy and became friends. But then if you wanted access, you had to go along with what the American military was saying. Otherwise you're not going to have that access. And then as a national security reporter, where are you going to work? If you can't get into the Pentagon, if you're not allowed to go on a deployment, if you're not allowed to go and visit the troops in Iraq.
That's right.
So it's a very well organized system to not just cancel or stop dissent, but also to cancel or stop or to really limit criticism.
And sort of manufacture a different type of reality, at least for the public, especially for the public consumption.
Yeah. I mean, I could tell you a story. We could sit here all day, right, Vincent? I could tell you I had, probably the biggest one that this happened to me was with Dan Rather. And so Dan Rather at that point, and this was like winter of 2010, maybe it was December of 2009, him and his crew had me go up to, he was doing like these he was on some type of channel. I can't remember what it was, Discovery or something like that. But anyway, he was doing these hour-long news programs, and him and his people had me go up to New York, and he spent 3 hours filming with me. And while we're walking, doing B-roll footage on, Manhattan Street, rather saying to me, I know you're correct because I've been going to Afghanistan since the early 80s. I know exactly what you're talking about. I know you're correct. Before I left that day, his producer comes out and he says, "Hey, I just got this email from this group at, blah, 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 and it was this strategic communications firm from, that was representing Central Command." And the producer basically reads part of it to me, and it's, "Hey, this guy's not saying who he actually was. He wasn't really there for that long. I'm on all these basic lies about me." And they, reading between the line, of course, was that if you want any further interviews with us,
that's right,
you need to. And when that special airs 2 months later or whatever, a month later, there's Dan Rather walking alongside General McChrystal or whoever in Afghanistan, and nothing from me, but no criticism at all in that piece. And here you go from a guy who says to me, you on the street, right, and who had been in Afghanistan many, many times, and he had cut his, he had started off as a war reporter in Vietnam, and he was very outspoken and very critical. And here he is saying to me, "I know you're right," and then because and the same thing too. I had a friend of mine get in trouble at ABC News because she was challenging. I can't remember. I think it was Martha Raddatz about her Afghanistan reporting. And it basically came down to, look, we want to get Martha Raddatz on the helicopter with General McChrystal. I mean, people heard this with the Epstein stuff, right? Or with the Harvey Weinstein stuff. There was that clip that came of Amy Robach from Good Morning America saying off camera, like, we had all this stuff on Jeffrey Epstein, but the network was scared it was going to ruin our access to the royal family. So they cut it. And the same thing, you read like what Ronan Farrow says about MSNBC and Weinstein. So you see, it just doesn't extend to the military, but it extends across all these elite industries that are tied together, that are coupled together because of their establishment. And they know, and for a variety of reasons, including like their major investors are all the same banks, basically.
Intertwined institutional interests, material interests, not just social and so forth.
That's right. I mean, the people who, the organizations that are the majority shareholders in the media industry, in the defense industry, in the agriculture industry, I mean, in all these industries, in the pharmaceutical industry, et cetera, are the same, 5 or 6 banks.
Right.
I mean, it's, but they also know too, there's that financial tie, but also like, if you're not, if one part of the establishment goes under, then the rest have the fear of also being pulled over, so that the collapse will become systemic, or it will be just, be metastatic, right? Will just spread across, and so you see this in other ways too. I mean, look at Boeing. Boeing can, what they did with the Boeing 737 MAX was absolutely criminal. They should be in jail for that. They knew that plane shouldn't be in the air. And then however many months later or a year later or whatever, they're getting a special authorized bailout from the Congress. I mean, so, how does that all work? Why does that all work? And I mean, you have to look at the relationships these institutions have with one another, as well as the financial concerns. And that's why, I'll give you another story about media manipulation by the Pentagon. I don't know if people don't know Danny Davis. They should look up Danny. Danny was a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and he spoke out publicly, wrote after he came back from Afghanistan, wrote a classified briefing for members of Congress disputing what the Army was saying about Afghanistan. This was in 2012. And he also published a somewhat of an unclassified version too. But, so this becomes front page New York Times story. And then the machine starts to roll against him, and he schedules and he tapes an interview with 60 Minutes. And the interview, after it's all said and done, it doesn't air. And he says to the producer, "What happens?" And she says, "I can tell you, I've been doing this for 25, 30 years. I've never seen a call from the president of CBS down to basically 60 Minutes canceling." And you can trace the conversation from, that level of leadership at CBS to the Pentagon and the relationship. And you can't listen to this guy. You can't. And if you go and you look at what Danny said in 2012 about Afghanistan, I mean, very prophetic, absolutely spot on, so it happens over and over again. And that's why I think, you could have these wars continue, one, without much attention, but also two, without any critical attention, because the interests of the media, the Pentagon, the defense industry, et cetera, the banks, are all intertwined.
So for the last 10 years, you resigned in 2009. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I think one of the things that's so difficult for the civilian population is, number one, we have a small percentage of Americans who serve. As a result, I think, and not only that, but also U.S. foreign policy doesn't play a central role in our sort of national political narrative. So I think a lot of people, in my experience, are very intimidated by these issues. If they hadn't served before, if they hadn't spent their time at university studying U.S. foreign policy, or if they don't know someone who's into those things or part of the anti-war movement, it's very difficult, I think, for them to relate. And even more so, there's all kinds of cultural and social pressures not to speak out about American exceptionalism, not to question, Uncle Sam's logic or morality abroad, the sort of values or so-called values that we're exporting. And so I think it's very true for civilians that I've found over the years. It's just very intimidated. So they see someone on TV, as you mentioned, they might be on CBS News, not knowing that they're also sitting on the board of directors for an arms manufacturing company. People listen to that individual. They don't know much about what's going on in Afghanistan. We live in a Rust Belt town here in Michigan City, Indiana. People are going to work 8, 10, 12 hours a day, working 2, 3 different part-time jobs, a crumbling public education system, not that much access to higher education. And so it's these issues I've found over the years are extremely intimidating for people. They feel like can they have a voice to speak out? A lot of people don't feel so. And so that's just an aside point that I wanted to make.
I agree. In a supermarket parking lot here, we have veterans only parking spots.
Same here.
Right? Yeah. I mean, so who are the only other people who have parking spots? People with disabilities, and you don't park in those spots because you don't deserve to. Right? Those people. I mean, that's the same thing too with the veterans. And that's just. I
do use them though. Sometimes
I only use sometimes. Yeah, it depends on how crowded the parking lot is. Yeah,
I'm not gonna lie. So tell us a little bit about the last 10 years, Matt. So you're out. You've left these institutions. You left the Marine Corps, left the State Department. It's 2010. We're in the middle of Obama's first term in office. What's the last decade look like for you? Because I would like to bring us up to today so we could touch on a little bit of the current topics today. But I'm very interested in your story because most of the veterans or people who have spoken out in the past that I've spent time around come from the enlisted ranks, and they also don't come from they don't have the kind of institutional connections that you had over the years or weren't in the kinds of positions that you were in. So I find your story particularly fascinating because so many of the veterans, including Sergio and myself, we came from a sort of a different experiential background.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys, as you were kind of speaking to earlier, Vince, you refused to deploy. The weight that must have taken on you, like you were saying, in terms of how hard it was being among your fellow Marines at that point, right? And the criticisms you endured, and then the harassment and everything else. No, I mean, I got job offers basically to a degree. Nobody is. It's always true. Nobody's going to hire someone who's not a yes man. I mean, so there have been problems with that, of course. But no, I've been with a think tank since 2010. Now it's my position there is unpaid now, but there's been times it's been paid. I've also tried to do other things to get away from it. I tried selling cars. I'm like the worst car salesman in the world. I worked as a consultant. I worked at the YMCA for a while, which was fantastic for two reasons, because it was a fantastic job, but I was making just 15 cents more than minimum wage. So it gave me a real appreciation for what it's like to work a 4-hour shift and have $22 to show for it. Your take home is, you work a full day and your take home is $45. I mean, so that kind of thing, it was very good for me to experience that, and just to understand what people are going through. But yeah, so I've been in and out of activism and the think tank world and speaking, and worked a lot with Congress over these last 10 years. I've done a lot of lecturing, all the kind of things that you would expect for someone who's involved in a movement to be doing. And it's all been, I have not had a family, been married, but with no kids. So it always made it easier for me. This is not, this is any type of activism, to include anti-war activism is not a path to financial success. That was one of the funny things.
Or relationship success, by the way.
Or relationships either, man. I mean, one of the things about I remember one of the things in my fake Wikipedia page that had been posted about me was that there was suggestions that I had gone to Afghanistan just to resign so that I could become like a big deal in the peace movement and make myself right.
I've gotten that one as well, by the way. Yeah.
That this was all planned, right? But no, I mean, but also too, I've been dealing with PTSD, I guess since I remember the first time I realized it was summer of 2005, hearing fireworks, and then, and having a girlfriend who was upset because I couldn't sit in the restaurant and look her in the face. I was always looking around, like that kind of stuff. And then 2007, when I come home, the moral injury has really kicked in. And that's when I start becoming suicidal. The drinking becomes medication. I'm trying to kill myself slowly by drinking. All those things start happening. I don't get help, but start getting help into 2012. And then about 2014 or so, the traumatic brain injury symptoms start surfacing. So, I've been in and out of work. For 5 years I couldn't earn a paycheck because of my TBI symptoms. And now now I'm doing this and I make I've got my disability, so I'm fine. And I make I make about $800 a month doing this kind of work, which, if you're 47 and you have a family, you can't do this.
No,
it's not possible.
No, it's not. And I'm in the same position, just to be clear.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I know you and Sergio aren't like rolling up in you're not rolling in it.
No.
I mean,
but we also don't have families.
You also don't have families.
So that's like part of the sacrifice. And I think part of it also gets back to what you're talking about, which is, I think there's numerous reasons why starting a family didn't particularly interest me coming home. I mean, two of those, of course, are the same reasons that you mentioned, and that is I have PTSD and moral injury, and I also have traumatic brain injury. And to your point earlier, some of those symptoms around traumatic brain injury I had always associated with PTSD.
Yeah.
And then when they started to learn more about traumatic brain injury, throw me under the CAT scan, give me, more and more scannings and so forth, they were like, oh, look, there's a portion of your brain that is sort of permanently bruised here. And if it continues, you're going to continue to deal with short-term memory loss, potentially long-term memory loss, compulsive behavior, which I had always attributed just to PTSD.
Yeah.
So same thing for me, really trying to balance things like alcohol, marijuana, sleep, relationships, and then rebuilding bridges and bonds that I think sometimes we destroy along the way, a lot of times unintentionally. I mean, I was so laser sharp focused on this work from the time that I refused that second deployment until the time I joined Iraq Veterans Against the War in 2006 and then testified to Congress in 2008. And then really since then, there's been such a laser sharp focus. And it's funny with regard to anti-war or anti-militarism activism, I think for the first few years I was involved, it was very cathartic. Around 2012, after about 5 or 6 years and right after we returned our medals at the anti-NATO protests in Chicago, it started to dawn on me that spending weekend after weekend at strategy retreats and conferences with other very traumatized veterans and drinking and sharing stories and talking with each other wasn't necessarily cathartic anymore. And that's when I really started to focus more on labor organizing. I started to work with the Occupy Wall Street movement, started to work with environmental activists, tried to branch out, and then, of course, as you know, you see how all of these issues are connected. So, really broadening my own politics, getting involved with Black Lives Matter. So that's really been the last, I would say, 6, 7, 8 years. And just now in the last couple of years, really probably since Standing Rock, Sergio and I went to Standing Rock with other veterans that we know, met up with Veterans for Peace. And what we found there, of course, was a lot of what I had seen with anti-war activism, which was people were able to mobilize and get thousands of people in a space. But then when we were talking with these veterans at Standing Rock, they didn't have anywhere to go afterwards. So we would ask them, who are you going home to? And they'd say, I'm going home to a small town in Ohio. There ain't shit going on there. There's nothing. So it's sort of the same for us. We had been involved in all of these massive mobilizations and social movements, but with regard to local politics or regional politics, or like having a base of supporters or people that you could bring into the anti-war movement. So living in Northwest Indiana, I would go to an anti-war action in Washington, D.C., New York, Boston, L.A., or Chicago, feel like I'm around all kinds of brothers and sisters, like-minded people with similar values, only to come home and feel very isolated, very lonely, very detached. And so that's one of the reasons why we opened the community center. And I would say primarily for organizing reasons and to have a hub to create those kind of social bonds locally. But I would say just in the last 3 or 4 years have I been now again willing to go out, give speeches about specifically U.S. militaries. Like I needed a 4 or 5 year break. Also, I think to read and learn about other things. I spent a lot of time reading about ecology, a lot of time reading about climate change, broadening my own perspective and knowledge. But I'm finding now, again, sort of find myself more comfortable in my skin today. I can't speak for Sergio or others, but I think that's probably the case with a lot of us. We go through these ebbs and flows and waves of this feels very comfortable or, oh, this is very destructive right now. What would your advice be? So there's going to be people who are watching this who are veterans, people who are asking some of these questions, people who will send this to friends of theirs or family members who are in the military. What is your advice both for the people who are in the military or in the government, maybe asking some of these critical questions, but then also your advice for people who have gotten out of the military or the government and served in those positions and might also have similar critiques that you and I have.
You know, if you're still in, one, I would say, you know, maintain your integrity. If it comes to a point where it's between your integrity and some kind of action, like saying deploying for something, if it gets to that extreme, you know, then it's time to take a stand, because as bad, I think, as it might be in the short term, long term, you're going to be much better off for your conscience, your mental health, your soul, and then of course then your physical health as well, because that's completely tied into your mental health, right? Stress is an absolute killer, and the worst stress is regret or shame or guilt, because you can't do anything about it, right? None of us have time machines. However, unless it's like at that point where it's that extreme, where you know, I would say if you're in, hold on, you know, maintain your integrity, but hold on, don't do anything that's gonna, don't do any type of dissent that's gonna get you arrested. We don't need another person in jail. Like that route, I mean, you saw the revelations that Snowden brought about, that Manning brought about, you know, and those revelations are important, but how much has changed because of them? What effect did they have? You know, Dan Ellsberg had a massive effect, but then the government and the military took notice of that. And I mean, so don't go to a court, you know, I mean, certainly people have questions about this. I can put you in touch with, you know, guys like Tom Drake or John Kiriakou or Jeffrey Sterling, or, you know, all these guys who have spent time in jail or who have had the FBI hold weapons to their children's faces, basically, when they raided their houses, you know, because they were doing what was correct, and they weren't even breaking the law. You know, they were just doing what was correct. So, you know, we don't need more people in jail. But
I agree with you.
We just don't, like, yeah. You know, and it breaks people, the amount, and I know these guys, I know Tom, I know John, you know, I know Jeffrey, like what they've gone through, both physically, mentally, it's wrecked their families, financially, you know, and that's what, look, if you want to come back to the understanding of warfare and how to take on an opponent, you don't fight them symmetrically. So why are you going to take on the United States government, which has all the money in the world, all the resources in the world, in a court battle that is going to be unfair again? This is why Ed Snowden won't come back to the U.S., because he knows exactly what will happen to him. Yeah. You know, he will be put in a secret trial and locked away forever.
That's right.
And so why put yourself? Be smarter about that, right? I mean, there's a lot of other ways to go about dissent after you're out than basically lighting yourself on fire. You know, and I'm blanking on his name. I think it's David Hale, who was a drone whistleblower. He's in prison now for going on 2 years now, maybe. Look at Reality Winner, who leaked one document. You know, she's in prison now for the next 15 years, I think. You know, I mean, like, so we don't need more people like that. As important as like the information that David leaked was, we know that the Department of Defense knows that 90% of the casualties from its drone strikes are civilians because of his leaks. That's right. As important as that is, I don't know, it hasn't changed anything.
And you have to have a movement to back these people up. I mean, the problem I have with a lot of the anti-war activists who encourage people to do this, number one, you're not going to be the one facing the consequences. Mm-hmm. And I think that always has to be taken into account. And number two, if we don't have a movement that can provide material and social support to the people who take these stances, I'm sorry, but I think it is extremely irresponsible to simply tell people to throw away their lives. And the fact of the matter is, right now, I mean, we can have a separate conversation, which we'll have to in the future. And I would like to talk with you more about, you know, current events, U.S. foreign policy as it stands right now, and even sort of rebuilding an anti-war movement, because in my thinking, it's one of the number one things that has to happen in this country. We need a new anti-war movement, and the new anti-war movement has to be more sophisticated than the one that I came up in. And I think what you're articulating right now is part of that sophistication. So anyway. I just want to compliment you.
Oh, thanks. But exactly that. I mean, like, and the anti-war movement has to really tie into like kind of like what you're talking about, Vince, with working among other groups. Being part of communities, being part of the labor movement, being part of the environmental movement. I've done the same thing too. I started getting really involved in environmental things, also animal rights. But I keep doing, well, people ask you about it. Being in the anti-war movement, being a veteran is basically a form of identity politics.
It is.
That's my identity. And it's the same thing as if I was only black. If I was black and I was only asked questions about the black community. Right. I mean, like, it'd be like having my, a family member one of my family members is gay. The only thing you ever ask him about is, LGBTQ, right? Even though he's brilliant on economics and right. I mean, yeah. Yeah. So, that is, the other part I was going to say about advice to people is you've got to recognize and this is what you were saying, Vince, and I was also speaking to, you have to recognize what's healthy and what's not healthy. What's driving you? Is it coming from a place that is where you're really trying to make change, where you're really doing this because where your passion lays, because this is your calling, because you're really trying to achieve justice for other people, et cetera, or are you doing this as a form of therapy? And it gets very dangerous, I think, for veterans because so many of us suffer from that guilt, shame, regret of the wars. And we're doing this as a form of penance. We're doing this as a way to try and make it up. And every time I try and leave this work, what seemingly inevitably draws me back in is this idea that I owe it to the Iraqis. I owe it to the Afghans. None of them have ever said to me, hey, you need to speak out against the war. Right. This all comes from this obligation to people who have not asked me to be obligated is something that I carry with me and is a form of it's a mental health problem. And so I think if for veterans or other people who are coming out of various industries looking to right the wrongs of what they've taken part in, you have to be very aware of what your motivations are, where from. And it's okay to do it, of course, and you'll be, but you have to be careful with it, and it has to be balanced with, proper mental health treatment and taking care of yourself and everything, because it can be very, very destructive. It can be a very dangerous spiral where all you do is concentrate. I remember times in my life where all I had, every day I was checking the website iCasualties. iCasualties is a website that posts all the deaths in the Iraq and Afghan war, all the American deaths, and looking at that, every day. And this of course was when there were, casualties every day in the wars. And, because I felt like I needed to know who these young men and women were, because I owed it to them to make up for their deaths, right? Because these wars were dying for no reason, and then when you couple on then say the Afghans and the Iraqis, and that's a big weight that you're putting on yourself and nobody asked you to. Yep. And so you got to be aware of that, what your reasons are, your motivations, why you're doing things, and how healthy that actually is.
That's some sage advice, my friend, on a weekend when I think so many of us are either those feelings come up. So it's wild. Of course, the contradiction is at the same time that I said I feel more comfortable in my skin, events like this happen, or a weekend like this comes up and I see or hear something, and it doesn't quite throw me into the same place as I was, say, maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago. Yeah. But it does remind you, or at least reminds me, sometimes how much more work there is to be done even individually. And so I think, something I would like to end with today is to sort of get some of your thoughts or what your message would be, not just to veterans, not just to victims of war or people who have participated in it, but it is Memorial Day weekend this weekend. I think for a lot of veterans, it's one of the more difficult weekends of the year. Both, how are you handling it sort of personally, but then also, what is your sort of parting Memorial Day message, both to the people watching or anyone who might listen to this?
You have to find balance. If you're affected by it, you can't avoid it, but you don't want to plunge headfirst into it. And I've done both. I no longer live in D.C. In D.C., Memorial Day weekend was always difficult for me because the Rolling Thunder would come in, which is the motorcycle organization.
Right.
And DC would be slammed with motorcycle riders, and you'd hear them. You'd hear them all the time, and that was always difficult for me because you could never get away from that sound. Where I lived, if there was the road went right towards Arlington Cemetery, so you heard them all the time. I lived less than a mile from Arlington Cemetery, so so I want to get away from the city and everything. And other times, I plunge in it. I do work with Veterans for Peace right down on the mall, right there, talking to people who were in for the holiday weekend. And, we had, it's a tower where people can inscribe on the tower itself messages to people who've been affected by war, who've been lost by war. And one of the things I learned from that is how many people are touched by war, and they don't realize it, or it's not something that's on their thoughts. So because how many people have lost an uncle to Agent Orange, or they had a grandfather that, and the more we learn about these things, the more we learn about how trauma can be passed down, through our genes, basically, passed on to children who didn't experience the war. They can still receive that trauma as a manifestation of being, from one of the parents. So there's those kinds of things that, I think about a lot, but I try and practice balance. I try not to, I don't, avoid having this conversation, now I'm also, because of coronavirus and everything, but, I'm also not going to go to a fireworks show or whatever, if we were in a normal period. I think one of the things we have to do much better is having people understand how much the wars and militarism take away from our own society, and how what's expendable overseas is expendable here in the U.S. And as the machine overseas, the war machine overseas continues to grind, right? I think back to Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. And in it, Steinbeck talks about the bank and how the bank is a living organism and it has to keep growing. If it doesn't keep growing, it dies. That's why it has to keep swallowing up all these farms, right? And that's how the war machine is. It has to start, so maybe just for sake of simplicity, we say it starts with Afghanistan in 2001, then it goes to Iraq in 2003, right? And then by the time President Obama leaves office, it's at least 7, more likely 15 with all the operations in Africa that nobody talks about, right? And continues to grow. And that's the same thing too with the wars here at home in the US, so the issues with migrants get larger, police brutality grows, inequality continues to expand. And we have to understand that with this pandemic, I think it shows very clearly the priorities of the nation, how people who are, they're deemed essential, just like you and I were, Vince, when we went to Iraq, we were deemed essential. But like, as I brought up earlier, like Donald Rumsfeld said, you go to war with the army you have, not with the one you want. And, you go to the pandemic with the healthcare system and society you have, not with the one you want. So you have people, and I'm glad to see them striking and everything, but people in McDonald's who are working there, not because they want to work at McDonald's, but because they have to, the other choice that they have. I don't blame. So in North Carolina, where I'm at, the restaurants just opened up yesterday. I don't blame these restaurants for opening up. They're not getting, they're being given no choice. Mm-hmm. What should be happening is that they should be being backed up by our society, by our government, so they shouldn't have to open up. Sure. So these people have, they have no choice. And they're not going to survive anyway. What restaurant's going to survive on 50% capacity? None of them. They barely make it with 100% capacity. Yep. So, but these people are the pawns, just as, soldiers and airmen and sailors and Marines were when sent to Iraq and Afghanistan, or now our proxy forces, right? Because we don't put our own troops into combat really so much. We use proxies, and we use automation as well. We use the drones, or we use manned aircraft or whatnot. But, so these are the ones that are expendable. We make all kinds of comments about how great they are. We make all kinds of comments about how wonderful they are, how we couldn't live without them, but then we don't even give them masks. We certainly don't give them health care. You know, I mean, so to understand that, and then to look at the priorities. Look, we've had caves in Norway for, I don't know, 50 years at least, maybe longer, that are packed with military equipment to fight the Soviet Union or now to fight Russia. We have ships in the Indian Ocean that are packed with tanks and bullets and you know, all kinds of things. You know, we have bunkers in Kuwait with the same type of, you know, to outfit a whole armored division basically. And yet we're told that we can't keep ventilators in storage because it's not cost effective. We're told that we can't keep a supply of PPE on hand because who's going to pay for it? Right. I mean, it's all about choices. And I think that's, I guess, the final point I want to make is just about the choices that we allow our society to make, allow our elected leaders, and then going along with the very specious arguments for those choices. But as we see, the same ones who suffered, look, there's 100,000 dead or so in the United States right now. That's 100,000 families that just lost a family member who died by themselves, hooked up to a ventilator in a room by themselves without having seen anyone for the last 2 weeks or so. And people are going to be traumatized by that. That's the way they lost their father or mother or brother or whatever for the rest of their lives. In the same way, too, that families sent their kids over to Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe they didn't get killed, but they came home completely different than when they left. And now the relationships and everything else, as we were talking about earlier. But that 100,000 families are who's paying attention to them? Yep. Who's right? Yep. You know, I mean, so yeah, I mean, I think it's those kinds of things that we could be thinking about Memorial Day weekend that we then have to extend into a larger anti-war movement that crosses boundaries and really shows other movements how whatever they're trying to do, it's never going to work. Look, the environmental movement is never going to work so long as the Department of Defense is ExxonMobil's biggest customer. 100%. It's not going to happen, right? 100%. You know, not going to happen. So unless that's understood, let alone the fact that DOD is the biggest polluter in the world.
That's right.
You know, so yeah, I mean, like it's that type of stuff that I think, you know, how do we bring other people into this understanding of how dangerous and how harmful not just the wars are, but militarism is in general?
That's what we'll talk about the next time we talk, Matthew. I really appreciate your time. Matthew Ho, sits on the advisory board of Exposed Facts, Veterans for Peace, World Beyond War. He is also a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy. I appreciate your time, brother.
Thanks so much, Vince. You have a good one, man.
Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parcmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Parc Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.